Welcome to part 2 of my Planet Defense game series. In this series, we're building a complete game step by step using Phaser 4. You'll find the full playlist linked in the description down below. Alright, in this video, we're going to bring our game to life by adding our Earth sprite at the center of our screen, and then placing our player's turret in orbit around it. Let's start by loading in the assets for our project. Under our source folder, let's go into Scenes and open up our preload scene. In this scene here, this is where we'll load all of our game assets, and then that way they're available for all the other scenes we'll create. So now let's remove our console log from our create method. So now for our preload scene, we want to make sure we load all of our assets before we transition to our game scene. To do this, let's use our preload method on our scene, and any assets we load in here, Phaser will make sure they're ready and available for us before our create method gets invoked. So now to load in our game assets, we need to load in all of the assets under our audio and images under our assets folder. Alright, so I'm going to open up our media browser. To take a look at our assets, we'll need to load for our project. So under our assets folder, under audio, and then our instruments folder, we have 4 audio files that we'll need to load. These audio files will include things like our background music and our sound effects we play, like when we shoot our bullets or when we destroy one of the asteroids in our game. Under our images folder, we have a few different folders, and so this is going to include things like the background for our game, our player's ship that'll orbit our planet, as well as the asteroids that'll be coming at our planet. We'll have a heart sprite sheet that will be used for displaying our planet's health, and then we have the background that we're using in our index.html file. So now for each of these assets, we need to load these in our preload method. Typically to do this, we would do things like this, .load.image, and then we can provide our cache key that we want to associate with this image data, and then the path to the image file we want to load. So instead of manually doing this for each of our files we need to load in, we're going to rely on our assets.js file. Inside this file, we have a few arrays that have objects that contain the metadata for each of our files we want to load in our project. So as an example, we have this image assets array here that references our 2 images for our ship and our asteroid that we need to load in. This provides us the asset key we want to use throughout our project, as well as the path to our file. And so to reuse this image assets array here, we'll need to import that into our preload scene. So at the top of our file, let's do our image_assets. We're going to do from, we need to do ... We'll go up a folder, we'll go into our common folder, and now we want to do our assets.js file. So now down our preload method, we can reference our image assets, and then we can use our for each method to iterate through our array. And now for each of our asset objects, we'll want to run this line of code here. So let's paste it. And now we want to reference our asset object. So we'll do our asset, and now we want to do our asset key. Now let's do our asset, and we'll do our path. So now if we want to verify if our code is working, let's jump over to our game scene. In our create method, let's remove our console log. Let's create an image game object for our player ship. So we're going to do this, we'll do add, and we'll do image to create our image game object. And now for our positioning, let's do 0, 0. And now for our texture, we want to reference our asset keys. So we'll need to come to the top of our file, we want to import that in. So we're going to import our asset keys from, we want to go up a folder, we'll go into common, and now we want to do our assets.js file. Now back in our method, let's do our asset keys, and we want to reference our ship. Now if we save, let's launch our game. Now when our game starts, up on the top left-hand corner, we should see part of our player's ship. So to fix this, let's update our x and y value. And so we're going to go ahead and do 200 for our x, and let's do 200 for our y. Let's launch our game again, and now we should see our player's ship on our canvas element. Now that we've verified our logic for loading in our images is working properly, let's jump back over to our preload scene, and now we want to load in the rest of our game assets. So now in our assets.js file, we'll want to load in our sprite sheet assets and our audio assets. So I'm going to copy our variable names, jump over to our preload scene, and I'm going to update our import statement to include those. So we'll have our audio assets, our image assets, and now we want to do our sprite sheet assets. So I'm going to copy this block of code here, I'm going to paste it twice. Now let's do our audio assets. Now for our audio assets, we want to do this, .load.audio, and then provide our asset key and our path to our audio files. Now for our sprite sheets, we'll loop through our array. Instead of doing an image, we want to load in a sprite sheet. For our sprite sheet, we'll do our asset key, our path, and now we want to do our configuration for our sprite sheet. So we'll have our frame width. For this, we're going to do our asset, and we'll do our frame width property. And now we'll do our frame height, and let's do our asset and our frame height property. Finally, for our game, we'll want to create any animations that we'll need for our sprite sheets that we loaded in our game. So if we go up to our media browser, I'm going to go into our images folder under Foozle, and a good example here is our asteroid explosion PNG here. So this file, this is a sprite sheet, and for our sprite sheet, we'll want to create an animation for once one of our asteroids explodes in our game. Our animation will need to know about all of the frames here and our rates that we want to play our animation in our game. So in our assets.js file, under our sprite sheets array, we'll see we already have properties here for our frame width and our repeat property. And so to create an animation for each of our sprite sheets, we need to come back to our preload scene. First, we'll need to wait until our sprite sheet texture has been loaded. And then once it's available, we can tell Phaser to create our animations from that sprite sheet. To do that, let's come down to our create method. I'm going to copy our block of code here where we loop through our sprite sheets array. So as we're iterating through our sprite sheets array, let's get rid of this code. Now to create our animation configurations, we'll do this to reference our Phaser scene. We're going to do anims to reference our animations manager. And now we want to do the create method to create our animation. So now for our animation, we need to give each animation we create a unique key. For this, we'll be using the same key as our asset key. So we'll do asset, and let's do our asset key. Next, we'll need to tell Phaser which frames of our sprite sheet should be used for this animation. Currently, all the sprite sheets we're using in our game, they'll be using every single frame for the animation we create here. So now to tell Phaser which frames we want to use, we need to use a utility method. We're going to do this. We're going to do anims to reference our animation manager. And now we're going to do generate frame numbers. And so inside this method, we'll want to pass in our asset and then our asset key. So what this method does is, based on the texture that we provide to this method, Phaser will use that texture information to dynamically create our frame configuration we need. If we go under our images folder, I'm going to open up our asteroid again. So as an example for our asteroid, when we provide this texture to that method, Phaser is going to take each of these frames and then create the frame information we need based on the texture information we provided up here. Finally, after we tell Phaser about our frames, we can specify our frame rate, so how fast we want this animation to play. So we're going to reference our asset, and let's do our frame rate property. And now if we want this animation to repeat or not. So we'll do repeat, and we'll reference our asset, and then our repeat. So now that we've created our animations that we need for our game, that wraps up all of our assets. So now let's jump over to our game scene, and we're going to start creating some game objects to add to our scene. To start with, we'll add in our backgrounds that we'll be using for our canvas element. And so for our background for our game, this will consist of multiple images. So if we open up our media browser, let's go under images, we'll go under Foozle, we'll have 3 background images here we're going to want to add to our game. Each of these background images are a sprite sheet that'll create a really nice animation once we play that animation for our game. For our background, first we'll want to put in our background 1 game object, we'll layer our background 2 on top of it, and then finally we'll add in our background 3. So for our background game objects, we'll want this to be behind everything else in our scene. So we're going to create those game objects before our players ship. Let's start with our first background. So we're going to do this.add. And since we want to be able to play our animations, we're going to create a sprite game object. So now for our sprite game object, for our X and Y value, we'll do 0. And now we need to do our asset key. We'll have our asset keys, and we want to do our background 1. Since this is a sprite sheet, we're going to use the first frame of our sprite sheet. So if we save and come over to our browser, we'll see our background game object has been added to our scene. Currently, our origin is in the middle of our game object, so let's update that to be in our top left-hand corner. So we're going to do set origin, and we'll do 0. If we save, let's come back to our game, and we'll see right away our background's been moved, but it's not taking up our full width and height. To do this, we'll need to scale up our game object a little bit. So if we come back to our code, let's do set scale, and now for our X property, we'll do 1. For our Y property, we'll do 1.25. Let's test one more time, and now we'll see our background is taking up our full width and height of our canvas element. Finally, for our sprite game object, we'll want to play our animation. So let's do play, and now let's reference our asset keys, and we'll want to do our background 1 asset key. All right, so we save and come back to our game. Our background game object should now be playing our animation, but for our first layer, it's very subtle, so you might not notice it moving very much. Currently, our background is very bright for our game, and so with this being in space, we want this to be a little bit darker. To fix that, we're going to update the alpha on our game object, and so we're going to set this to be 0.4, and that way our game object should be more transparent with our black background, and now we have this nice color here. So now that we have our first background game object, we now need to create 2 game objects for other 2 background layers. To do that, let's copy our line of code here for where we create our first background. We're going to paste it twice, Let's update our asset key we're referencing. So we'll have background 2, and then we'll have background 3. We'll want to update our animation that we're playing. All right, so now if we save and come back to our game, we should see this very nice background that we can use for our game. So now before we create our planet game object, one thing we're going to do is we're going to refactor our code for how we're creating our game objects for our background. Currently, our code is very repetitive since we're doing the same thing for each of these game objects. Instead of doing this for our code, we're going to create a simple for loop, and we'll use that to create our game objects. So let's do for, we're going to do let I equal 1. If I is less than 4, let's increment I. Let's copy one of our lines of code. So now inside our for loop, we'll create our game object. I'm just going to format our code a little bit. And now in our for loop, all we need to do is update our asset key that's being used when we create our game object and to play our animation. To do that, let's do asset keys. We'll do our bracket. Let's do our backtick. And now instead of doing background 1, we're going to do background I. Let's copy this and we'll do the same thing for when we go to play our animation. So now let's remove our 3 lines of code above our for loop. Let's save. If we come back to our game, we should still see our background. Nice. So now that we have our background game objects, let's create our planet. For our planet, we'll want to create a sprite game object. So let's do this.add. Let's do a sprite. Now for our X and Y value, we want to position our planet in the center of our game. To do that, we can use the scale manager on our scene, which will allow us to grab our properties for our width and height for our game. So for our X value, let's do this to reference our scene. We're going to do scale to reference our scale manager. And now let's grab our width property. We're going to divide it by 2, so that way we'll be in the center of our screen. Now we'll do the same thing for our height. So we'll do this.scale.height. Let's divide that by 2. And now for our asset key, we're going to do asset keys, and we'll do our planet. And since this is a sprite sheet, let's do 0 for our frame. And now we want to play our animation. So we'll do .play. Let's do our asset keys, and let's do our planet. We save, and we come back to our game. We now see our planet game object has been added to the center of our screen. So now for both our player and our planet game objects, we'll want to store a reference to these 2 game objects on our class. That way later on, we'll be able to reference them. So the top of our class, let's add 2 private properties. First, we'll create a property for our planet, and now let's create a property for our player. So now we have our 2 properties in our class. Let's come down to our create method. Let's do this. We'll reference our planet property. We'll say equal to this.add sprite for our planet. Now let's do this, and we'll do our player. We'll say equal to this.add image for our ship. And that's it. We've now loaded in all the assets that we'll need for our project. We've set up our animations that we'll need. And then we create our background, our player, and our planet game objects. For our background and our planet game objects, we use sprite game objects. That way we'll be able to play the animations that we created. In our next video, we'll work on adding in logic to allow our player's ship to orbit around our planet.